Good afternoon to everybody who's joined from the UK, and good morning to those joining from the US. Welcome to this webinar this afternoon hosted by Greenstone, How to Begin Your Sustainable Procurement Journey, where we will be tackling the topic of sustainable procurement and how to get your organization to begin to address the creation of this function. I'm Giles Scott Hayward, Head of Supplier Portal at Greenstone, and I will be taking you through the webinar today. We have 30 minutes, so hopefully you'll be able to stay for the full length. And what I hope we achieve today is to provide you with clarity on how we at Greenstone see sustainable procurement, how we work with clients to implement changes to current supplier processes, and some practical advice to get you started on your sustainable procurement journey. So please enter any questions that you might have in the question box provided. There's a little diagram for you there. We won't be doing a Q&A at the end of the webinar, but we will respond to all questions directly. And if appropriate, if there's enough questions, we'll create an FAQ document to share with everyone following the webinar. So sustainable procurement is a result of the wider need for companies to not only understand and manage their impacts on society and the environment, but also the need to maintain competitiveness and compliance in a changing commercial environment. Supply chains represent an area of enormous potential impact for companies, be it from the level of finance transferred, local working conditions, or greenhouse gas emissions, for example. Sustainable procurement should be a recognition that the supply chain represents an area of risk for companies, but also an enormous opportunity for positive impact. And we've had hundreds of registrations for today's webinar, so it really is evident that this is an area that's gaining increased traction within organizations. Today we're going to cover the following areas. I'll just tell you a little bit about Greenstone and then talk about the relationship between sustainability and procurement, what drives the integration of the two, and how at Greenstone we help clients along their sustainability journey. Hopefully we can give you some practical advice, and we'll have a little look at the software side of things as well, and why people are selecting or moving to software solutions. So a little bit about Greenstone. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking to you about us, but there will be a number of people on the webinar who are unfamiliar with what we do. So hopefully it would be helpful to provide a brief overview. Since 2007, Greenstone have been providing award-winning software solutions that enable our clients to become more responsible businesses. Our software is built by us and implemented and supported by our expert team of sustainability consultants. Our solutions range across 4 different areas of environment, frameworks, health and safety, and supply chain, and are aligned with over 30 international frameworks. Today, we'll be particularly focused on the work that we do around implementing Supplier Portal into our client organizations to ensure that they create a more transparent, compliant and responsible supply chain. So hopefully that just gives you an idea of what we do. So sustainability and procurement, I just wanted to start by looking at the relationship between the two. And the challenges faced by organizations with traditional structures in combining the two to create a positive effect. Obviously, this relationship is key to underpinning this whole discussion. So procurement is changing, which means the way organizations engage with their suppliers, manage their supplier relationships, and make their purchasing decisions is changing. And I think there are multiple factors that contribute to this, such as more global supply chains, perceived efficiencies through digitization, and the changing way in which services and goods are delivered. Sustainability is a key part of this evolution of procurement, and therefore needs to be fully understood, I think, before it can be effectively implemented. For business to be sustainable, it needs to adopt a process whereby it can maintain these changes in a balanced fashion, and needs to be able to address the interconnected areas of environment, economic and social across all the functions, and that includes very much the supply chain. However, a key challenge in aligning sustainability and procurement functions and practices lies in that until recently, organisations have not necessarily been structured in such a way that facilitates alignment. The most obvious examples of this being the difficulty with which organisations assign responsibility for tackling their supply chain. So even if the alignment of supplier management practices with corporate sustainability goals is something that is required by senior stakeholders, the roles at individual and department level don't necessarily reflect this. The most natural area of a business to address supply chain risk and compliance, for example, is often seen as procurement, as this is where the relationships with the suppliers naturally exist. However, traditionally, the success of a procurement function is determined by value and service delivery, meaning that anything that diverges from this could be misconstrued, misunderstood, or treated with skepticism. Conversely, the sustainability or legal and risk teams within an organisation are well placed from a knowledge perspective to assess suppliers on relevant metrics, gauge compliance and satisfy reporting requirements. However, they're not necessarily best placed to leverage the supplier relationships or apply their knowledge to the supplier selection process. So there's just a natural disconnect in the current situation. So the only solution is to deploy an integrated approach that embeds sustainability into the operations of the organisation. This approach should cover, ideally, the full procurement cycle from the tendering stage and contracting through to the continued management of that relationship and hopefully the supplier performance review process. This diagram, produced by EY, actually a couple of years ago now, very simply demonstrates the dispersed nature of supply chain responsibility. It's this that needs to be coalesced into one coherent, integrated, and ultimately more sustainable approach. So how to successfully adopt a more integrated approach depends on the structure of the organisation, and is something we will look at through the course of the webinar. The key, however, is that the lines of communication are open between these different areas and the appropriate functions of the business to ensure that good governance practices and positive environmental, social and economic impacts are achieved throughout the entire procurement and supply management process. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a background and understanding for the way that procurement and sustainability are starting to interact. But what sits behind the need to break up this cross-functional approach that we've talked about? What's driving the organisations to integrate sustainability into existing procurement functions, which actually, when judged on traditional metrics, can appear to be operating successfully in their current guise? So organisations are now operating in a world where their responsibility extends beyond the challenges of their own operations and into far-reaching global supply chains. The result is a heightened risk, both financial and reputational, that can only be addressed through a transparent, inclusive, and ultimately, I think, sustainable approach to the entire procurement process. So we briefly mentioned the difficulties in applying an organisation-wide responsibility to a single area of operation, as it were. Not only does an organization need to have a clear understanding of how the different stakeholders interact, but they need to have a clear idea of what they want to achieve. The first step is to identify where they are and embarking on this journey in the first place and what is driving it. So we've broken this down into the following thematic drivers: resilience, responsibility, risk, policies, and opportunity. So resilience, to start with, I think resilience means the ability to recover quickly from difficulties. And a supply chain that cannot do this can hardly be classified as sustainable. This is obviously not a new concept, but with the changing climate, there's more focus than before on changing weather patterns and growing seasons and extreme events that can impact availability of supply. And there are, of course, a multitude of additional impacts such as water scarcity and social unrest that too need to be mitigated. Responsibility. Well, if resilience reflects mitigation against potential impacts on the supply chain, then responsibility represents the increased accountability for the impact of operations. A sustainable organization and a sustainable supply chain is one that minimizes a negative impact on its workforce, local communities, and the environment. In the most mature examples, integrating sustainability into procurement and taking responsibility beyond your clearly defined operations can generate a huge positive impact. Thirdly, risk. I think risk is probably one of the most obvious and important drivers behind integrating sustainability into procurement and the efficient driver behind any business. The increased scrutiny on supply chains represents operational, financial, regulatory, and reputational risks to an organization. Businesses tend to be risk-driven, and when faced with such risks, involve the relevant operational and knowledge bases within the company to address them. So it's a natural response. The proliferation of regulations and standards in the procurement world provides a framework within which organizations can operate and report. However, they also represent a compliance requirement that, if not met, can easily negatively impact the business. In some instances, the responsibility of organizations goes beyond merely just compliance, though. Stakeholders such as investors, clients, and consumers are far more aware of the impact of companies and, in particular, their supply chains than ever before. And dropping below the standards set by these stakeholders and their expectations can damage an organization's reputation, sometimes beyond repair. Ultimately, though, all risk condenses to a potential negative financial impact. And the adoption of a sustainable approach should not just be about mitigating this, but identifying and maximizing any financial opportunities. So fourth, we have policies. So I think policies can be looked at two ways. Policies can lead an organization or be driven by other factors. But ultimately, policies commit an organization to certain actions, targets, and levels of performance. Increasingly, suppliers are seen as an extension of the organization. I think we're all aware of that now. And responsibility needs to be taken for understanding who they are and how they operate, in order that they too align with the standards laid out in any particular and relevant policy documents. If an organization has adopted a sustainability policy, for example, this can then be reflected in a mandatory code of conduct for suppliers or green procurement policy to enable supplier performance and KPIs to be tracked. So lastly, opportunity. As we've already covered, organizations often adopt a sustainable approach to procurement, and as a result needing to mitigate the risks. But once the sustainability lens has been applied to all aspects of a business effectively, then with this clarity, I think comes increased opportunity. This can be through longer-term and more symbiotic relationships with suppliers, changes to the production and delivery of products and services, and improved environmental and social practices. But it's clear, I think, today that the most successful organizations of the future are not those looking at this as a problem, but those driving change are those that are looking to create and take advantage of the opportunities that are available. So the sustainable procurement journey. When we work with clients, it's important to understand not only what is driving their desire to change, but also to understand what they are currently doing and where they would like to be. In order to frame this discussion, we use what we call a sustainable procurement matrix, the aim always being to enable organizations to advance their sustainable procurement capability in a manageable way. And that means that it aligns with their capabilities, their capacity to change, and their overarching goal or target. Whether they're just beginning to tackle sustainable procurement or if they're relatively mature, we aim to provide the environment for them to continue this journey. So I know that matrix is very small there, and I just wanted to point out the kind of the structure of it, in that we break it down into the themes, the levels, and the goals. But we'll be sharing this form as part of the sustainable procurement introductory guide that we'll be sharing with you after the webinar. So don't worry too much about the content. But very briefly there, as I mentioned, any program of activity is broken down into a series of actions grouped by themes, and these are focused on what clients want to achieve. So these themes are risk, supplier management, compliance, analysis and reporting, and the software that underpins each level and goal. So looking at the goals for each level that we take out of that matrix there, we can see how organizations mature in their approach. From level 1, where you may be looking at this for the very first time, level 2, where there's a degree of integration in your approach between sustainability and procurement, level 3, where you meet best practice in some areas, maybe even best practice in your sector, right through to level 4, where sustainability is entirely integrated in the way the organization and its procurement functions. So that's a journey that almost all organizations are either on or hopefully looking to embark upon. But just to touch on the benefits that can bring, I think the benefits of integrating sustainability and procurement can bring to your organization are many, but include things like long-term or longer-term supplier relationships, a focus on long-term risk and opportunity. You're not just looking into the immediate future. The opportunity to be an industry leader and with it the benefits that brings. The possibility of being ahead of regulation, and we see it across all of our products, is that the biggest driver for achieving best practice or best in class is not regulation, it's going beyond that. A more engaged workforce. I think it's expected that those we employ expect to work for a responsible organisation. And then we have reduced risk from a delivery point of view, and no longer non-compliance. And of course, ultimately, what I hope we're all looking to achieve, which is a positive impact on society. So, changing the culture of an organization, however, is obviously a huge undertaking. And in some instances, certainly when sustainability is involved, it can fall upon rather few shoulders. And many of you may be looking at this for the first time. Let's call it being at level 1 in the matrix or the journey that we looked at just now. So from that matrix that we outlined, I've pulled out some of the initial steps that you can take to move your organization towards becoming more sustainable in its approach to procurement. These are, of course, by no means exhaustive, but are, I hope, likely to apply to a large range of organizations. So first, Identify which supply chain related regulations affect your company. And this could, of course, relate to regulations that you need to adhere to, but also relate to commitments that your company's already made in its policy statements, on its website, wherever that may exist. And you need to consider country-specific standards and legislation, and of course any voluntary commitments that your organization has made. And then you need to understand which areas of the business these affect, or indeed are responsible for compliance. And this could be geographic areas or indeed business functions that are assigned this responsibility. And then naturally understanding that helps you address the suppliers in a more focused and relevant manner. Number two, create and assess suppliers against the code of conduct. And this is, some of you may view as extremely basic, but also for others, it represents, I think, and we think, a necessary and an effective starting point. Because what this does is create a base level of compliance across all of your suppliers. This at least provides a demonstrable supplier engagement process and can inform the basis for future and more detailed engagement programs. So this code of conduct should align with your corporate strategy and your own legislative compliance requirements. And supplier attestation should, of course, be mandated and recorded and should be mandated in the supplier selection process, but recorded on an ongoing basis. And ideally, you should have the ability to provide live compliance statistics that have been recorded and can be reported upon. Number three, develop a consistent approach for a more holistic supplier assessment. So this should and will provide a comparable assessment that can be used across all of your suppliers and apply to all business functions when reviewing that data. So hopefully it's providing utility across the business. This could be based on global reporting frameworks such as GRI, UNGC, linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously provides that focus and overarching umbrella. And it should include cross-functional requirements, indeed compliance requirements, so risk, legal, sustainability, health and safety, IT security, and so on. Number four, it may seem very simple, so utilize the assessment information. So there's no point gathering information if you don't use it. And this is not just from your perspective, going from the effort of engaging those suppliers, but it's entirely demoralizing from a supplier standpoint not to receive feedback on their submissions. And the way to do this is to identify non-compliances and communicate to the relevant business areas to take the relevant action, and of course communicate this to suppliers. If there's no non-compliances, you can use performance metrics to embed them in the supplier selection and ongoing supplier review processes. And then lastly, to create a deeper supplier review or audit process. Now, I know people talk about audit and going beyond audit, and that's totally understandable when you're referring to an approach which drives the wrong type of behavior from your suppliers. However, what we're talking about here is a deeper review process carried out with a view to improving your relationships with those suppliers and not ending those relationships in an ideal world. So you can link this further assessment to a review process. So high risk or poor performance drives deeper assessment or an audit, if you want to call it that. But also the opportunity to then work through improvement plans with suppliers and, provide audit holidays for good performance and things like that. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, I guess, going beyond audit and creating something that you can work with suppliers on. Now, to finish off with, I just wanted to address our final theme in the Sustainable Procurement Matrix that I introduced to you, and that is of software. So at Greenstone, we provide our supplier portal software, but we understand that there are a number of solutions available. And really, it's about choosing the correct solution for your organization. And I think it's interesting and useful to understand why you're choosing your solution, but also interesting for us to look at why organizations are looking to adopt software to help with the integration of sustainability and procurement. So I just thought we'd look at a few of these, and these include driving accountability, transparency and efficiency, simplifying the supplier engagement process. Online environments are usually more, easier to use and provide a better experience than offline spreadsheets. Something to enable compliance, assurance and reporting. A system can provide a centralized area for supplier data management and can unify other systems and processes that you have across the business. The need to collect bespoke content and carry out bespoke analysis. There may be certification standards out there, scoring methodologies, but ultimately, for a lot of organizations, this comes down to directly managing your suppliers and requiring specific sets of information and applying specific types of analysis or weightings to that data. And that's a very bespoke way of assessing the suppliers, and that needs to be thought about when selecting a tool. Obviously, a system should improve the analytics and reporting capabilities that you have in place currently. Otherwise, it's not worth getting. And also provide robust due diligence procedures. So something that you can rely on from a third-party audit perspective, or if you're putting yourself through an ISO program or certification, then the system should be able to provide the robust evidence of the due diligence that you're doing on your suppliers. And then lastly, we talked about unifying processes and data systems through integration, but engaging internal and external stakeholders. So whether that's reporting down or up the supply chain. So that's just a few reasons why people are looking at software. Through Supplier Portal, we enable clients to create responsible supply chains, and we aim to provide businesses with a single point of transparency across the supplier network. So hopefully ensuring that compliance, performance and risk can be managed relatively seamlessly. And we do that through a number of functions listed there. So supplier assessments, scorecards and flags, so analysis tools, reporting capability, action management, so directly managing corrective actions with suppliers, facilitating audits, compliance management tools and system integrations, along with contract management. So those are the themes that drive our approach to hopefully simplifying this process. And if we just look at a couple of them in a bit more detail, supplier assessments based on best practice assessment questionnaires, but enabling organizations to embed things like codes of conduct. Audit facilities, whether that's facilitating third-party audits, carrying out your own automated online audits, or just providing a repository for that information. And lastly, analysis tools. So creating a consistent supplier assessment and the KPIs that you can not only track supplier performance against, but report on your own supplier engagement KPIs in your annual report, for example. So that just gives you just a flavor for Supplier Portal. As I said, it's more about finding the tool that's appropriate for your organization. And in our sustainable procurement guide that we'll be distributing to all of the attendees, we put in a section on selecting software as well. And that's certainly not purely focused on selecting our software. It's about selecting any sustainability software and related to sustainable procurement or supplier management. And so we put in some do's and don'ts associated with that selection process. So hopefully that's something that you find useful. So thank you very much for joining today's webinar. I hope it's been a useful and I understand, of course, somewhat brief introduction to sustainable procurement. But really it's how we view sustainable procurement here, and hopefully how we help people progress on that journey. So as I said, put any questions that you've had today in the question box and we'll provide an FAQ document to all attendees. We'll share the slides, obviously, with everyone that's been here today. And we will, as I've mentioned a few times, share with you our sustainable procurement guide as well. So hopefully that will be of use. If you want to get in touch with me, then please do so. My contact details are there. And very lastly, before we say goodbye, we'll be at the Sustainable Leadership Purchasing Council event in Portland, Oregon, next week or the week after, May 20th, 22nd. So if any of you are there, then please get in touch and we can connect at that event. Thanks very much again. Enjoy the rest of your day.